So I'm going to actually begin the presentation by talking about my own life and really how I came to this place of Liology. So I'm actually going to begin with a picture of me as I looked roughly 15 years ago or so. Yes, that was me. Kind of hard to admit, but there I was. I was founder of an internet company, and I was planning around, when this picture was taken, to be taking it public about a year or so later. And to all intents and purposes, it looked like I was just on top of the world. It was like such an exciting time. And then within a short time after this, it's like my whole world crashed around me. My former wife became seriously ill with some serious health problems that led to her passing away after a number of years of struggling with them. And I left the company after it had gone public to look after her, to really devote myself full time to taking care of her. And within a short time after leaving the company then collapsed. And there I was with basically everything in my life that had been meaningful to me collapsed around me, just crashed. But what was strange is that at the same time it's obviously feeling bad about it, and I wasn't feeling the sense of despair. I was actually feeling a sense of opening, a sense of possibility. And what it was about is I realized that, in fact, my whole life up till that time had been like living in what I sort of thought of like a bell jar of values. It's as though all the values that I'd built my life around were fixed and kept me somehow from everything else that was out there. And it's like everything had crashed, and now was my chance to really build my life again, but build it in a way that was truly meaningful to me. And I vowed to myself that whatever I did with my life was going to be absolutely meaningful to the core of my being. So I had to figure out, what did that mean? And I decided I wasn't going to take anyone else's word for it. I wanted to find out for myself, where was meaning in life? And that really translated to this search for what is the meaning of life. And I'd heard all these things about the soul. What was the soul? That's what I wanted to know. And so I went on a couple of parallel sort of metaphoric journeys, if you will. One was an experiential journey through practices of meditation, yoga, qigong, as well as really exploring some of the great traditions on the earth, like Buddhism and Taoism. And at the same time, I went on a conceptual journey. I wanted to understand what are the frames of meaning that we have that are received in our world. Where do they come from? So I went all the way back to evolutionary psychology and the whole expanse of human history, and looked at some modern disciplines like cognitive science and complexity science. And it was those two journeys together over a number of years that led me to Liology. So one of the first things I discovered on that conceptual journey was that early traditions saw the human spirit as embodied. They saw a fuzzy boundary existing between the body and the spirit, between the human person and that person's spirit. And of course we see that all the way today in a lot of indigenous cultures that maintained a continuity with those traditions. But it turns out that in early history, right around the same kind of time, both the ancient Greeks and the Indians both separated the human soul from the body. So the Greeks called it the psyche, and the Indians called it Atman, but they both agreed that there was something that had that the source of meaning was something absolutely separate from the body. In fact, the body was like a prison that this Atman or psyche was imprisoned in. And then they applied that to the whole world, the whole universe. And they both saw the source of transcendent meaning as coming from somewhere totally different from the world. The Greek tradition really evolved into Christianity, which called it God. And the Indian tradition called it Brahman. And both traditions obviously developed in very different ways, but they both agreed that transcendent meaning was up there, and the material world did not mean anything. In fact, the Indian word Maya is translated as illusion, that the material world is just illusion. And what I found really interesting then is I was looking at modern mainstream science and the idea of modern mainstream reductionist scientists. If they were fine with this picture, they agreed completely, because for them this transcendent meaning didn't mean anything anyway, and all that mattered was the material world. So, in fact, they were very explicit about this. One of these reductionist scientists, a name a lot of you might know, Francis Crick, he was the co-discoverer of DNA, Nobel Prize winner. So he wrote a book called The Astonishing Hypothesis. And this was his astonishing hypothesis, that you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will, are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. And he wasn't alone. So, like, for example, there was another, out of the whole array of these reductionist scientists, another great Nobel Prize winner. This one's a physicist called Steven Weinberg. Well, he looks appropriately sad in this picture when you discover what it was that he had to say about the world. It's a foundational statement of reductionist science. The more we know of the universe, the more meaningless it appears. So, mainstream science and spirituality both joined in this thing of separating meaning from the material world. Up there you have transcendent meaning, down there you have the material world. That translates into our modern day as religion and science. And religion is responsible for telling us about the soul, about God, and connecting us with transcendence, of being the source of our values and spiritual meaning. And meanwhile, scientists are responsible for telling us about physics, chemistry, and biology, and ignoring values totally and the source of spiritual meaning. But that wasn't going to work for me. I realized that I was beginning to narrow the search. What I was looking for was a source of meaning that was coherent, that didn't require great leaps of faith into some other dimension, that existed across the different domains of human understanding, and that allowed me to integrate all the parts of my own being. And I noticed that in ancient China, they'd taken a different approach, that the tradition of Taoism saw a different source of meaning. It recognized that the universe was something in constant flow, that everything is connected. And it saw value and meaning arising from the Tao, which was intrinsic to the natural world. Now, in China, there wasn't just Taoism. There were also these other great traditions. There was Neo-Confucianism, and then Buddhism, in its very early years, really permeated into Chinese culture and became an integral part. So that there were three great traditions grew up in China over many, many centuries. And about 1,000 years ago, and during what was known as the Song Dynasty in China, a group of philosophers synthesized these three great, profound traditions into one integrated set of thoughts and ideas. So from Taoism, they took this notion of the dynamic Tao being intrinsic to the universe. From Buddhism, they took this deep sense of the interdependence of all phenomena. And from Confucianism, this notion of the identity of the self embedded in society. And out of these three traditions, they formed their own understanding of the universe, which they called the School of the Tao, which we know in the West as Neo-Confucianism. And with this set of ideas, they developed a systematic and coherent cosmology to describe the entire universe. These Song philosophers saw the universe as comprised of chi, which we can think of in modern terms as all of energy and matter, and Li, the principles according to which all this chi is organized. Now, as I was coming across and getting deeper into understanding these philosophers, I realized that in systems thinking and in modern complexity science and systems biology, they were describing a similar picture for how the entire natural world is organized. These systems thinkers were describing a picture of all living entities as being complex, self-organized, dynamical systems. So I began to ask myself, did the Li correspond to the principles of these self-organized systems? Well, at this point, you might be asking yourself, so what are these principles of these systems thinkers? And that's what I'm going to take a closer look at right now. So the first of these principles, which really all of us come from, is that the interactions between things tell us more about things than the things themselves. So we see this everywhere in the natural world, whether it's looking at starlings flocking, or the schools of fish in the ocean, or the patterns of sand dunes in the desert, or the whole weather system of the Earth, or even the spirals of galaxies far away in the universe. It's the interactions that tell us more than just the chi or those things themselves. Now, if you're having a little bit of a hard time really getting your head around this, I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of, a little exercise with me to think about it. Think of a photograph of yourself when you were just a little child. So here's one of me. So when I think of that picture, I know that that's me. Just like you know it was you when you think of a picture of yourself as a child. And yet, there's virtually no cell in me that's existing right now that was in that little boy. And even those few cells that do stay in us all through our lives, the molecules within those cells are always changing. So we can be virtually certain that there's not a single molecule that existed in that little boy that's existing in me today. And yet I know that's me. So why is that? What connects me with that little boy? It's the principles of the way in which those molecules and all that energy and matter connects. That is what connects me. It's the actual principles that give me that sense of continuity and that identity and the stability to every organism that exists in the world. So, if that's the case, if these patterns are what connects us and what actually gives us our real sense of identity, I want to look a little bit more about the different kinds of patterns we're talking about, because it's not all patterns that we're looking at here. So, we can think of rigid patterns of connectivity, things like crystalline structures. That's one extreme of how a pattern can be. And at the other extreme, think of completely random patterns, just like the pattern of smoke as it sort of billows up into the atmosphere. But now, the space in between these two is what we're talking about, where imagine rigidity as it becomes less rigid, becomes more like structure. And imagine randomness as it becomes a little bit more structured, and randomness becomes more like flexibility. And it's when that flexibility meets that structure that you have what some complexity theorists actually call the edge of chaos. And that is where life and complexity emerges. And in fact, this is an image of the human brain, which is the most complex structure that we know of in the universe. And that's where you have this structure and flexibility where everything is always in flow and always connected, just like the Tao that we were looking at before. But now, when these complex patterns, when the interaction with these complex patterns increases and increases, something really interesting happens, because the level of complexity doesn't just go up in a straight line. What happens is it has what is known as a phase transition, and the level of complexity reaches a whole new emergent level of meaning. So that's a little bit kind of conceptual, but we see this everywhere in our world when we begin to recognize it. So, for example, when lots and lots of words connect in a complex way, then language emerges. When computers connect in a complex way, the internet emerges. When organisms connect, an ecosystem emerges. And when neurons connect, consciousness emerges. So the thing about these emergent systems that get created is that none of them are autonomous. All these systems are continually interacting with other systems around them. And then there's a certain type of interaction these systems have, which is unique to these kind of emergent systems, is that each one is fractally connected within larger systems. What is a fractal? A fractal is a pattern that repeats itself at different scales. It indicates self-organized activity, and it's everywhere in the natural world. We see it in the shape of coastlines, in the patterning of leaves, and in lightning, in the structure of our lungs and our bodies, and of course in those neurons that organize to form our brains and cause our consciousness. And when systems thinkers got to understand this, they really started to recognize that nature itself was like a fractally connected organism, where each cell in the natural world is part of an organism, and each organism is part of a community, and each community is part of an ecosystem, and each ecosystem is part of the entire earth, known by some as Gaia. It's this kind of organism, it's the entire earth. And some complexity theorists recognize this amazing cosmos that they are beginning to understand. And they've been looking for a conceptual framework for this modern systems theory. And one of them, a leading one called Stuart Kauffman, has written a book in which he says, what is the weave? No one yet knows, but the tapestry has an overall design that reflects underlying law, principles of self-organization. He writes, we enter new territory. We are seeking a new conceptual framework that does not yet exist. That, I have a feeling that if one of those Neo-Confucian philosophers, somebody called Cheng Yi from 1,000 years ago, heard Stuart Kauffman talking, he'd say, hey Stuart, and this is what he actually did say, actually all things can be understood by their lead. As there are things, there must be principles of their being. Everything must have its lead. So, what are the lead? Well, we can think of the lead as the organizing principles of the natural world, the ever-moving, ever-present set of patterns which flow through everything in nature and in all our perceptions of the world, including our own consciousness. And what's so amazing about the Li is the Li can be understood through the mathematical insights of complexity science, as well as through the traditional wisdom of East Asian practices. So what then is Liology? So Liology represents a fusion of that traditional spiritual wisdom with scientific rigor. It's Liology. Liology is about understanding the connection between mind and body. It's about understanding our connectedness within ourselves, with others, and with the world. So if that's what Liology is about, let's take another look at what is Liology, this thing that I'm talking about. Liology is a framework for experiencing life in an integrated, embodied, and connected manner. Liology redefines the word spirituality as connecting with meaning in one's life. And it sees the most profound meaning in life arising from our intrinsic connectedness. Our connectedness with every cell and integrated system within our own bodies and with every living entity in the natural world in which we're embedded. So to get a sense of some of the implications of what that means, let's go back to that notion of the universe as being consisting of Li and Qi. And the Li really describing the quality of how the Qi connects. So we can understand a little bit. If we just imagine that we're sort of walking across the room and we're bending down to stroke that lovely cat. And as we're doing that, what's going on is that my qi of my hand, my body, is connecting with the qi, the energy and the molecules of that cat. But the quality of how that qi connects is the li. So if I'm connecting with a quality of love, that cat will receive it and feel pretty good about being stroked. But if I'm connecting in some other way, if I'm just really feeling stressed and I'm feeling disharmonious and I go down to touch that cat, but I'm not connecting with that love, well, that cat might recognize that, and this might be the kind of response we get from it, which I didn't expect, because the quality, it's the same qi, the same energy is connecting, but the quality of that connection feels completely different to that cat. So the implications of that connectedness are profound. Like, imagine the lake, like ripples that get created in a lake whenever a stone is thrown in. And what it means is everything you do in your life creates Li ripples, which affect everything else in the universe. Which leads to this kind of fundamental principle of Liology, the ultimate connectivity of everything in the cosmos. So with that understanding, you see that we exist in an ocean of Li. We are continually being reformed by the Li ripples of those around us, while our Li ripples are simultaneously reforming them. And with that understanding, with that sense of connectivity, we can recognize, and another implication of Liology, that non-dual experience of oneness that some of us here may have experienced ourselves, and probably everyone knows someone who's really had that sense of that sense of oneness, that can be understood scientifically as a core recognition in our being of that true interconnectivity of all the qi within us with the universe around us. And then, remembering my earlier search, looking for the soul or the spirit, well, we can begin to understand the Li ripples we create as forming our spirit. Something that lives on even after we are passed away and gone. So instead of seeking meaning from transcendence, Liology sees meaning as arising intrinsically from the material world. And instead of seeking some eternal soul up there, Liology sees meaning and spirit arising from our embodied existence. And that meaning connects each of us intimately with the entire universe. So, some of the principles of theology, in fact all of the principles of theology, arise from this underlying sense of connectivity, such as the principle that science is actually intrinsically connected with spiritual meaning. Another principle is that our values and ethics, according to which we live our lives, arise from that connectedness, that network of connectivity in the universe. Another principle is that knowledge, real knowledge is something. It's not something that's just in our head, some conceptual, abstract thing, but real knowledge is embodied. And then another principle is that traditional practices can connect up with modern techniques to allow us as human organisms to most fully experience the fullness of our lives. And the final principle here is that all of these other principles exist within our fractal connectivity with the natural world. So I'm going to leave you right now with just what are some of the core values of theology. And they all arise from that principle of connectivity. So the recognition of our connectedness is what in theology we call love. The embodied experience of our connectedness is what we call harmony. And finally, the expression of our connectedness, even when we're not recognizing or embodying it, in theology is what we call kindness. So I'm going to end this first presentation there and just give you one more time this kind of definition of what I'm calling theology as a framework for experiencing life in an integrated, embodied, and connected manner.